So today's video, I don't really know what to call it, except I'm going to call it the Colluding Women. And I'll tell you a little bit about my own journey, then I'll tell you about a thesis that I was involved with, and then I'll talk about some, let's say, big time cases. And all of this sits on a continuum. We had in a previous video, we talked about continuums. So we don't want to be thinking only in terms of, let's say, victim or perpetrator. Sometimes the same person can be located at different moments in their entire life story. Maybe over here they're a victim, maybe more of a victim, maybe at some point they start slipping into a zone that could be called perpetrator.
So like Precious's mom?
Precious's mom, for example. Exactly. So Precious, for those of you who haven't seen our previous videos, we talk a lot about a particular movie called Precious, and in that one movie, which we'll be calling a documentary, there's actually quite a lot of content about all kinds of social work issues, social work with families, social work with victims of abuse, structural issues, and so on. So we often refer to that as kind of an iconistic, I guess would be the word, story for us to reflect upon. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my own story to get us started there. So, as I've said in previous videos, I was sexually abused by my father from my earliest memories till my teen years when I got away. Simultaneously, he was physically, emotionally, and sexually abusive to my mom. So, since today's video is on the colluding women, that's what I'm going to call my mom. And I give this as an example that's very, very painful. It's incredibly painful for the social workers, for the members of the family, and for someone like my mom. So you could say my mom was a victim in that from their own conversations and behaviors along the way, I remain convinced that my mom was date raped, and that's why she ended up being pregnant. She was pregnant with me. I'm the cause of their marriage. At that time, in that context, for those two people who were my biological parents and legal parents, my mother felt impelled to marry my father, although she may not have adored him, hard to say. But at that time, what would be called a shotgun marriage, although perhaps not an actual shotgun, but the pressure. If you were a woman and you were pregnant, your parents and your family would coerce you to marry, to do the right thing, and to have your baby. And that was me. So I would suggest in a story like this one, which I believe happened all over the world and perhaps continues to happen all over the world. There's nothing rare in that story as I've just told it right there. Because of the stresses, the pressures, because of their limited learning opportunities, because their limited friendships, because all kinds of supports were not available to them, and because they were in desperate poverty. My parents fought, they weren't happy, they had me. My father became more stressed out and started hitting. Again, my earliest memories are of him yelling and throwing things, and of my mom crying and screaming and that kind of thing. Soon after I came into the world, I have a brother, and then a few years later is a third child. In between all of that, my mother had one baby that was stillborn, and so I can't even imagine looking back on what it might have been like to be her, to feel herself in an unfortunate circumstance, with violence in her life, with poverty, being very desperate, isolated geographically, rural isolation, and being completely unprepared to be a mother. I also know my mother was adopted, and it's possible that she had fetal alcohol syndrome. We don't know what the story was of her biological mother, but my mother had a real hard time staying focused on tasks. The house was always in chaos. The fridge may have had tons of milk but no cereal, or lots of cereal and no milk. So some of those things that are considered part of the idealized mother's role of keeping the laundry done, the dishes done, the food in the fridge, meals on the table, she seemed to have some struggles with that. So, at what point does my mom start to shift from being a victim of her unfortunate circumstances to being an abuser. And this place on the continuum, I'm defining abuse as in neglect at that point. She was neglecting or neglectful of what could be seen as her parental responsibilities to feed and care for and protect and to love and nurture her children. She wasn't able to do that. At some point, she came to know that he was abusing me, physically at least, and then at another point she came to know, and I'm absolutely certain of this, that he was sexually abusing me. So this is where I would say she becomes the colluding woman at that moment. I think she chose or needed to dissociate, to pretend like she didn't know, to cope. She didn't feel she had a lot of options, as it is, again, very, very, very common statistically across the world. There are women who, for a variety of circumstances, feel they have no options. They think, well, what would I do if I left him? Where would I go? At that time, there were no shelters. At that time, women couldn't get a good job and provide for her kids herself. Her parents coerced her emotionally to stay in a marriage because that was the right thing to do when you had kids. You married and you stayed with that man for your lifetime. So, given all of that, what do you do if you're a social worker with this kind of a story? You've got this, if you were invited into that story, let's say if when I was 10 years old, the school had informed the Children's Aid and they had come into our family and looked at the chaos, the violence, the grief, the trouble, the despair of all people involved, my father, my mother, myself, my brothers. What would you say and do? I'm going to recommend that if you're involved in those kind of stories, one, I don't believe the family can be maintained. I believe the father has to be taken out of that story, even if charges aren't laid or if charges can't be held. The father needs to be separated from the kids and the mom. In this particular story, I would suggest mom needs to be separated from the kids, if only for a week or a month or some period of time where everybody gets to reflect, gets good counseling, gets good support, gets good nutrition, good rest, good advice, good everything. And then possibly in limited amounts of time, mom and daughter could have time together. And if mom was prepared to take in new information, new parenting skills, if they could get into subsidized housing, if they could have regular intervention and support from a social worker type person, I believe there could be hope to heal the mother-daughter bond and the mother-son, my brother's, bond. A lot would depend. I want to say very, very, very emphatically, everything that I know, everything that I've been through, everything that I've read, feel, all the research, I'm almost 60, this has been basically a core story of my entire life. I do not believe the father can be put back in that family. Here's why. Even if the father went through 10,000 miraculous epiphanies and profoundly useful counseling, every time the daughter looked at him, she would feel the memories, the threat, the fear, the disgust, the loathing, the shame, and the contempt. Whether he was putting that on her or not, she would still feel it. She is still a vulnerable child. She does not feel that she can assert herself with him, given that for the last 10 years she has not been able to assert herself with him. Every time he raised his hand, she would flinch and feel maybe he's going to hit me again. I don't believe that this is viable. There's 1,000 more things I could say about this. I know, though, that there are religious groups, and I know there are families, and there are some cultural groups who have the belief that family reunification has to be the #1 goal. I don't believe that in these stories that is wholesome for the daughter, and I stand very strongly for that. Having said that, I want to talk about some other big stories to talk about this whole thing of the colluding woman. For lack of a better term, I'll just call it that. and wanting to say continuums, don't forget continuums, and don't forget the idea that we respect and we offer tenderness to her, that she at some point was probably a victim, and we need to help her heal from that kind of stuff, and then process with her better ways to be in the world. So I feel there's hope for her and for Dad. There's hope for everybody in every story until we find there is no hope. But with incestuous perpetrators, with pedophiles, we know that it's the research suggests it's very unlikely that they can be fully cured from eroticizing children. And in some subsequent video, maybe I'll talk about working exclusively with sexual offenders. But for the moment, continuums. Now I want to talk about, I was involved with a thesis. A very, very smart woman, Ridley is her last name, and she did her thesis interviewing adult women like myself, older adult women who had been sexually abused as children. She interviewed, I believe it was 15, it may have been 10. She interviewed them longitudinally and asked them about their feelings and the healing and so on that they had gone through. And my memory of her thesis is that all of the adult women who had been abused as children, who had a colluding mom, or a colluding mom figure, all of them felt continuing in that relationship would have been or was very destructive to their well-being, their own healing, their freedom, their journey, self-esteem, dignity, all that stuff. The colluding mother, unless she really, really, one, admits what has happened, two, requests forgiveness, finds new strategies for being a parent, and has space and time to tenderly and incrementally implement that stuff, there's no way the daughter can ever fully trust her, believe in her, and have an earnest, sincere, meaningful relationship. So my own experience is mirrored by that thesis that I'm describing and is mirrored by the research. So now I'm going to talk about some stories that are way more extreme than the one, in some ways, than the one I've just described to you. So these are really famous case studies, let us say. One is the story of Karla Homolka and her husband, Paul Bernardo. And they were referred to as the Ken and Barbie killers. Thank you to my researcher here, Carlene, who helps me with my notes. So this happened while I was living in Ontario. And the basic plot line of the story was Karla Homolka and her husband, Paul Bernardo, were the classic type of people that you would never suspect of sexually abusing. They were young, white, healthy, in love, educated, middle class. They both had jobs. They had everything going for them compared to the stereotype. When we imagine a sexual abuser, you tend to think of some guy called Igor who jumps up from behind some bushes, right? You tend to think of someone, somehow you imagine, I'll look at someone and I'll know that person is a sexual abuser. Let me erase all that from your mind.
Well, that's why they were called the Ken
and Barbie killers.
Because they were so pretty and so non-expected, and that's why also the case took so long, because even the police were like, nah, he couldn't be. And like they had hints that would have suggested he was that person, and yet still, much like
blonde hair, fancy car, young.
Exactly.
And anyone who hasn't been educated the way we have, we often imagine if a man has a beautiful wife, why would he ever sexually abuse? He has a beautiful wife. The stereotype is if you can't get it at home, you'll go and get it somewhere else. That's the imagining of what a rapist is. But we know many sexual abusers, it's not about intimacy, sensuality, loving relationship. It's about fucking and raping and abusing and having power over and control over someone else. It's a much darker kind of thing. So again, to all the future social workers out there, we've been given 1,001 big lies that a priest wouldn't sexually abuse, a cop wouldn't sexually abuse, a judge, a lawyer, a teacher, a coach, Paul Bernardo, a handsome young man. The basics of that story were that Karla Homolka wanted to offer her sister to her husband as some kind of birthday gift or something like that.
Yeah, he had communicated that he had wanted to rape, and instead of being repulsed, she like indulged it. And then yeah, as a gift and an attempt to keep him happy with her, because what she could give him wasn't enough, and he wanted more, she was like, oh, then I can give you my sister.
Yeah. Yeah, and then from my understanding, Karla actually drugged her sister, and then they did sexual things to her, and they videotaped it, and somewhere in all of this, the sister died, perhaps not intentionally, perhaps there was some ambiguity about that, but once that had happened, now Karla and her husband were locked into a sort of evil path, let's say. Subsequent to that, they also lured, you could say Karla lured, you were describing earlier that they
had two minors, a 15-year-old and a 14-year-old, sorry. And yeah, they were lured into the cars by Karla. She would get them to come over to her car saying she had mechanical issues, and then he would come up from behind and kidnap them so that he had the physical force to overpower them, and she just needed to get the trust.
Right. So this is where it's so unexpected, because the average person who's lived an average life, who hasn't done research or thinking about how awful people can be, we think, well, how could a husband and wife sexually abuse? It doesn't fit any of the IKEA shelves we have in our mind. And so here Karla was able to get away with a lot of stuff. Even at some point, Karla cut a deal with the police to talk about what had happened, but at first she portrayed herself as a sort of abused wife who had been coerced into this situation. Subsequently, the police found videotapes hidden in a lamp in a ceiling that showed her as an active participant who wasn't a poor victimized wife who, let's say, was terrified for her own life if she didn't do these things for her husband. It was at first that was the stereotype that she was able to work for herself, but then when these videotapes were found, it became clear that she was as excited to be part of these stories as her husband was. So there's a story, I'll come back to that in a bit, but I want to tell you a couple other kind of stories of this extreme examples of the colluding woman. There's also here in northern BC, Crystal Hendricks is her name, and she was, sometimes this is referred to, I think, as the Willow River story. She tricked young girls into coming to their house. I think Crystal herself was only about 20 or 22 or something. Do you remember how old she was?
The first, she was 19.
19.
And he was 37.
And he was 37. So they were a couple, similar to the Homolka story here. And I believe they had a baby together, a young baby. So Crystal would approach girls and say, come and babysit for us. Would pick up the girls, who were maybe 14 or 15 even, and on the way home or at home would give them a drink or a pill, and they would become, I infer it was like a fentanyl type drug or opiate, something that would make them the date rape drug.
So subdue them.
To subdue them. And so this went on. She set up these girls to be sexually abused by her partner, and this went on for a few years from my memory of it. When they finally were caught, I believe there were at least 3 of these babysitter kind of stories. And again, it was on video. So it kind of suggests to my mind that there may be 100 other stories like this, but there was no video. So the perpetrator we could slide to the spot if, it's all the man, he set this all up, it was the man who did this. But we know from these two stories that the videos and then the later testimony of the victims, the babysitter girls here, that Crystal Hendrick played an active role in tricking, luring, abusing, tormenting, ruining some aspect of the identity and hope and innocence of these girls. So that happened. Now another kind of iconic story out there, or ugly avatar story, is the Elizabeth Smart story. Now in this one, some of you may remember, she was only 14. Is that correct? Oh my goodness, only 14. And this man came into her home in the middle of the night kind of thing and abducted her.
Yeah, the only witness to it was her little sister, and the reason she didn't was because he threatened her and said that he would come back and kill her if she told, so she waited a whole 2 hours after she was taken before she told her parents.
Yeah, so just these are extreme cases and they're bizarre, but we want to notice the pattern. The pattern in this case is the perpetrator scared the other witness, and the witness believed it, right? Of course they're going to believe it. This is how they get away with it, what they do. So now this guy, Brian David Mitchell, he was married to Wanda Barzee. We have the names here, and my memory of this is the three of them traveled like a religious cult kind of trio. He had the women cover themselves up like nuns in some kind of cult, and they traveled around, so they were in plain sight for 8 months.
Yeah, they said that his place where he was originally keeping her was only 3 kilometers from their house, so she could literally hear their voices calling for her, but she was too scared to call out and say where she was.
Yeah. So eventually, Elizabeth Smart did have, my memory of this is there was some kind of police check or police stop or something, and here's something to remember. Always, always, always separate the people in the story. Don't ever ask questions of a victim in front of her alleged perpetrator. You must always put one kid in one room, a kid in another room, the mom in another room, the dad in another room, and always make that your standard protocol. Never interview people in any suspected story like this together, because all the perpetrator has to do is give a look, and the kid is afraid, or the wife is afraid, or they know that later when they get home, or they imagine later when they get home, he'll beat them up, or later when he gets home he'll murder their dog or their cats, or he'll set the house on fire, or the perpetrator has put threats into the minds of all the people in the story, and they believe those threats. And you know what? Often he means it. He will go home and kill the dog or the horse, or burn the house down, or go kill their mother or their grandma. That's not just an overactive imagination in a kid's mind. So, here's the pattern I wish you to get from all of these stories. 1, the women were able to utilize the standard stereotypes of, well, no woman would do that to a little girl, or no woman would do that to her own sister, or how could a beautiful woman with a beautiful husband actually be sexual abusers, right? So we want to note that. We also want to note that I'm going to guess that all of those women we just talked about, and also in the movie Precious that you brought up earlier, the woman herself was abused at some point earlier in her life, or she has a learning disability, or she has a mental health issue, and or she has an addiction issue, and or something that let's say the primary perpetrator has managed to find a synergy with. He probably then, maybe not so much in the Homolka case, but maybe the Willow River case or the Wanda Barzee case, incrementally the woman becomes more and more indoctrinated into his worldview. And the slippage is very incremental. It's not like one day this happens. Brian Mitchell and Wanda Barzy, they may have been together for 5 years before this happened. And one day at a time, one idea at a time, he has isolated her, diminished her self-esteem, made her feel that she is a lunatic, taken away all her friendships and all her other ways of seeing herself, so that she is simply a vessel for his intention. He says the best color is blue and chicken is the best meal. She's going to agree with this. He says we're going to abduct a girl so that I can have a second wife. She's going to agree with that. She's going to go along with it. So these are extreme stories. My own story is not that statistically extreme. And the thesis that I'm Bernadette Ridley's master's in social work thesis, where she interviewed adult women who even 20, 30, 40 years later were still impacted by their childhood sexual abuse, and were still impacted that the colluding mother was still trying to ruin their lives or say it never happened, or that they still found themselves feeling horrible if and when they had any contact with the colluding mother. So I want to tell you this happens in the world. We need to ponder it, and we need to reflect on getting rid of our own biases or blind spots or imaginings. That's a pattern you're going to have. At first you go, this can't be happening, right? I'm thinking also of a story where there was an indigenous couple, and the father or stepfather had been beating the little boy, and at one point he murdered the little boy, and the mother knew that. They both together buried the little boy, and the mother said, oh, I don't know where my boy is. He just disappeared one day. So the mother colluded in covering up the death of her very own child. She knew what had happened, but she covered it up. And I think in the story I'm thinking of, this is a few years ago, that it was 2-3 years later that the body was found of the little boy, and even still the mother was at first saying, I have no idea how this happened. But subsequently we did realize she knew, right? Mm-hmm. So were you able to share some more details of this? Because I know you've been researching. Did I miss any of the details of these stories that our viewers might find useful?
No, I think you've got all those covered, but I actually found a couple more that were pretty relevant.
Okay.
So one was Angela Gordon and her second husband. I'm probably going to butcher this name though. Junaid Abu Hamza.
Okay.
Okay. So they starved their 7-year-old daughter.
I kind of remember this.
Yeah, this was in 2008. And they removed her in 2007, in January 2007. They removed her from the food program and told the school that she wasn't allowed seconds. Then they removed her in that December from school entirely. In 2008, she died of pneumonia and meningitis. And she died weighing only 2 pounds. She was 7. And she had over 60 external injuries. And that happened in Birmingham.
Okay.
And
so the basic structure of the story is mother obviously knew something was wrong, but either she wasn't able to fully comprehend it or wasn't able to be effective to intervene, and or she was mentally damaged in some kind of way with some mental illness. But we have to know mom is involved. She is an active person. We can't make her exclusively into a victim. When something goes on that long, mom has responsibilities to step up. So our challenge sometimes is to be able to see the person as both a victim who needs help and guidance and support and clarity, but as someone who needs to be stopped, contained, changed, punished, perhaps, what our legal system does, and at very least separated from that child.
Yep.
And not returned. See, if we go by our original first video where we were talking about the family and bloodline and the law, a lot of people still will fall back and say, well, that's her blood child, and this is what the law says. That's her legal child. Mm-hmm. Well, we're not seeing the affinity there. That third zone of affinity. If the blood mother and the legal mother is not caring for the child, we have to stop that. We have to insert ourselves as social workers, as social justice activists, and change that story. Mm-hmm. So there was another story you found.
There was another two, actually. So, the first one, Rosemary West and Fred West. This was in 1995 when this trial took place. However, the murders took place starting in 1971 when Rosemary was 17 years old. She murdered her 8-year-old stepdaughter, Charmaine. However, Fred at the time was serving a prison sentence, so she hid it from him so that he wouldn't find out. When he did return, she just pretended that she didn't know where she went and that she just kind of went missing. However, they proceeded to kill 10 women, including their daughter. Yeah. That murder of his daughter took place in 1987. She was 16. And over the course of the trial, they tried claiming insanity. And essentially, she convinced the jury that she was, until later videotapes of her leaving the trial and at home and stuff showed her talking about the trial itself and talking about how easy it was and how well she played them. Right. And then she was retried again. And the second case that I found was kind of relevant were the Philpotts, Mary and Mick Philpott and their friend Paul Mosley are serving 17 years for arson that was planned. They set fire to their house, killing 6 children, ranging from 5 to 13. And it was all done in an attempt to frame the husband's mistress, who was trying to get custody of some of his children. Okay. So I guess he had fathered 17 children over the course of his life. Yeah. And she was trying to get custody of these 6, and instead of give them a just trial or try and find what's best, all 3 of them colluded and set fire with petrol to their house and killed all the children inside.
So, of course, these are very extreme cases, and it's just even hearing them is a burden on our heart. And I think a natural urge that any, let's say, statistically normal person, an ordinary person with ordinary behaviors, you'd be tempted to say, oh, well, these are extreme cases. This kind of stuff rarely happens. It's not going to happen during my career. And I would hope not. But as social workers working with victims of abuse or working with families, we need to be alert of a continuum. And don't let yourself be tricked by stereotypes. Don't let yourself think, oh, well, it's a beautiful family, they have a lovely house, they have nice dining room set, right? Because the class issues can confuse us with the Homolka case, or with this religious guy, David and Wanda, because they claimed that they were religious, devout religious people. Most observers were tempted to say, oh, well, it's a religious thing. It's a religious thing. They just, oh, it's a man and his 2 wives, or a man and his wife and his daughter, and because they were walking around in plain sight amidst all of these things, right? Like the people yelling for where's this missing girl, or the posters, right?
Yeah, they were literally able to hear everything that those people were saying, and she couldn't even say anything to them because she was afraid she was going to be killed.
Right, and he also had threatened, if I remember this correctly, to say, I know where your family lives, obviously.
Yeah.
I could go back and kill your parents, or I could kill your sister. So we have to know the perpetrators, whether it's the male or female perpetrators, or a colluding female, that they can say things that will keep the victims under control that are not always visible to us. Right? So you meet with a family and you think, well, look, everybody was sitting nice in the living room. And the kids all said, yes, thank you, and please, and so on. Maybe an hour after you leave, they're being raped or beaten, right? Maybe something very bizarre is going on in that household, and it's almost so bizarre that you can't even imagine it, right? Because sometimes you have to, if you're, let's say, a normal person, you kind of, the range of possibility is here. And some of these stories, you have to let your mind wander for a minute. If there's evidence in front of you, you have to not let stereotypes or assumptions block you from being vigilantly curious about what might really be going on in this family. And do not engage, in my opinion, as a feminist social worker, with the collective group of the family in front of you. That might be something you subsequently want to do, but if you have any curiosities about anything going on in a family, you have to speak to every person individually and depthfully and heartfully and really listen. They may give you one little flick of a hint that something's going on that you may need to pursue more fully, but they're not going to ever tell you the full truth of the horror and trauma in their life if they are literally terrified that an hour after you leave, something bad will happen. And the perpetrator may have, whether it's the female in Karla Homolka's case or these other cases, may have given them evidence. They may have previously beat the dog with a stick in front of the kid, right? Or killed the kid's cat, or beat mom up in front of one of the kids. These are not outside the realm of possibility with the clients that we might be working with. And here's another weird part, or difficult part, a challenging, intense part, is when you meet them individually, you have to trust to let everybody tell their full, complete story. And in that moment, hold your judgment. Just listen to it. Ask questions. Fully get it. Because if you've interviewed mom and she tells you what a wonderful family they have, right? My mother, the last conversation I had with my mother, in a face-to-face conversation, she was telling me how wonderful her marriage had been and how wonderful her life had been. And I was astonished that she could say that, and she, the Lord had provided her with a happy marriage. I witnessed her being beaten. I witnessed her having him throw things at her and humiliate her. I witnessed him have sex with other people. I witnessed him sexually abuse me. Right? Like, how could you say you have had a happy marriage if the father of your children raped your daughter? It's impossible for those two truths to be together. And I think what happens with many of the women in these kind of stories, they get to a place where their life is so horrific or so overwhelming or so impossible that they have to disassociate from chunks of things that are happening right in front of them. So I think sometimes someone like my mom, she just kind of went into a fog and just tried to only focus on the things she could control, and she resigned herself from the things she felt she could not control, and just focused on, he said he loves me, Jesus also loves me, I have had a happy marriage. Because to look at the truth would destroy them, maybe. It would just completely crumble them. They would flood with so much shame and grief and self-remorse, they might have to kill themselves, right? Like Karla Homolka, without support and counseling, we're going to hope that Karla, when she went to jail, from my understanding of how Karla's story continued to unfold, She went to jail for a few years. She got a degree in psychology, apparently, the rumor mill has it, and left jail and got a degree in psychology somewhere in all of that, and changed her name and is living a happy life. So I'm hopeful that that is sincere and real, and that she totally had huge epiphanies about where she went wrong on her life's journey, and we would hope that for every client.
Mm-hmm.
But I would be very cautious to ever put those kids back. Like if Karla had 2 kids with Paul Bernardo,
And all of a sudden she's like, I'm going to keep these.
even if Karla has got all her healing done and so on when she gets out of jail, the kids meanwhile are hopefully if she had kids, she didn't, but if she did, or like in this Willow River story, Crystal Hendricks had a baby with James Bennett was James Bennett. So that little baby, I hope, even if Crystal is now out of jail, which I understand that she is, I hope that child isn't back with her mom, unless mom has had tons of therapy and counseling and guidance and so on. Elizabeth Smart, from my understanding, has become an advocate, a feminist advocate, is out there doing lots of workshops and educational sessions about the trauma that can happen in these circumstances. And her whole life experience right there offers us profound wisdom of why don't people tell. Because, again, the story would be like the person who's innocent of how these dynamics unfold would be like, how could she go 8 months without telling? Well, she must have liked it or she wouldn't have stayed, right? But
yeah, exactly. Because they were saying that they would eventually, after time, let her go into the public by herself, and she could go grab things. And they were like, well, if you were by yourself, why didn't you just go to someone and ask for help?
because they said if I went, they would kill my sister or they would kill my mom or those kind of things. And if at 14 years old, you might believe that.
Well, that, and I
You
mean,
would
at one
take
point,
that into your head,
they
right?
had her shackled to a tree for a few months anyways, so at that point, like, you've already been literally bound. So what's to make you think that the next time, like, if you go out and you try and get help, if that person doesn't believe you or whatever, your family can die, and if he catches you again, you're going to be bound and probably raped again, and even worse than it was before.
Right, right. And many times that is, in many of these stories, the woman or girls or boys or victims or a thing called Stockholm Syndrome comes to be in place. The human mind gives us a mercy that we start to weirdly bond with our oppressor. And that's a whole psychological syndrome that can happen, and it's a true thing. It's a true thing. And also they may have, as you've just quite wisely pointed out, they may have run away or tried to resist and been so hurt or harmed that they gave up that hope or that option. They just, okay, I tried 3 times, all 3 times either I wasn't believed or I was beaten or they did go and kill my dog, and therefore I will resign to my fate. I will submit to my fate. So we as social workers with families or with individuals, social work with victims of abuse, there's a lot going on there, a lot of dynamics. And if you have any story like this, please go and get clinical supervision. Please go and get mentoring from your colleagues. If you have a nagging kind of question about something, go and double check with your colleagues. Don't just put it, oh, well, they seem like such a nice couple, right? If you have any kind of third eye or subconscious unsettledness, please go and check, because you could be literally saving a life. You could be saving more than one life. You could be saving even a multi-generational story. We know in many stories people will say, well, we almost changed the situation at this point, but then it went on for another 3 years, or it went on for another generation. Like in the story of Precious, if we go back to that first classic to wrap up this video, that Precious's mom, at some point in our video of that, admits that she was abused. Mm-hmm. And we see Precious was abused.
So you can only infer that Precious's grandma was also...
Precious's grandma, we're going to guess, probably was abused. So whether physically abused, economically abused, emotionally abused, sexually abused, or all of the above, if grandma, mom, and daughter, but if we could intervene and we can stop things, we can maybe 7 generations into the future and further make families and individuals way happier, way better. We could prevent deaths, literally. When we see these, this isn't a happy bit to end on, but when we see these stories on the news where the classic is a man, all of a sudden a man shows up with a gun and he shoots his wife and he shoots his 2 kids and it's a mystery and he shoots himself, and almost all of those stories, I would suggest to you, if not all of those stories, the neighbors saw something, grandma saw something, the teacher saw something, the nurse saw something. People saw or felt something. But because we have been trained to think of the world a certain way, oh, Paul Bernardo is such a nice guy, he's got a great job, his wife has a great job. It's not possible for a Barbie and Ken beautiful young couple to be sexual abusers. It's very unlikely, but these things do happen. And you know what? This is a thing to think about. What if you're wrong? If they truly are a normal, happy couple with happy kids, and so you went in there and you asked some questions and you were very curious and you asked a few more questions, and it does turn out that they're a beautiful, happy family and somebody just misunderstood something. Yeah, so you wasted a couple hours of your day. Versus if you go in and you're right, right? Better to intervene and change a really, really bad trajectory that's unfolding. So were there any other things that I missed there on the, let's say, we'll call this video the colluding female?
No, I think maybe just like going back to the Philpotts, the arson case, maybe just considering that the problem that maybe be brought up with you might not necessarily be the problem that they're dealing with. For example, like this, like the motivation for this was entirely outside of the house. Like it was the fact that the husband was cheating, and was trying to frame the mistress.
Okay.
And the wife was just, I guess, using it as like a means to an end. Okay. And kind of like Karla had said, that like she felt she had to go along with it in order to make them happy. Yeah. So they felt like their decision in doing something really horrible was like a means to an end almost.
Okay. So the pattern we want to note is whatever the stereotypes we have in our mind, let them go. And any woman could do a bad thing just like any man can. Also, whatever they say, there could be a secondary truth or a hidden truth. If our intuition tells us something as social workers, keep pursuing it till you find what might be going on. Be cautious. Not to be overly suspicious, but be suspicious. Mm-hmm. Be a little bit suspicious. And maybe in your whole career, there'll only be one horrible story like this that's, like on this level of horrible. But there will be many stories. If you are a full-time social worker doing family counseling, or working with victims of abuse, or working with women in shelters, or working with the legal system, you're going to have women somewhere on this continuum. Whether they're just slightly looking the other way while dad hits the kids, or slightly looking the other way while dad sexually harassed maybe not his own daughter, but his daughter's best friend, right? So you're going to have women somewhere on a continuum. And
actively or passively.
Actively, passively. And for all the people in the story, we want to have compassion, because that's what we are as social workers. We're always hopeful. We're always trying to be compassionate. We're trying to see the whole life trajectory. Okay, well, I understand that this is what you were doing, and I understand why you were doing it, because you were afraid, or because you've been so worn down, or because you dissociated, or because you have a culture or a religion or a belief that the man always knows best, or whatever the reasons are. But still, we need to stop that unfolding. We need to interrupt all the dynamics there. And the pattern is our best practice, in my opinion. Interview everybody separately. Interview everybody more than once if you can. Come back again and again and again until your intuition is soothed, until you feel clear of what's probably going on. I know that's an ideal, but in some agencies you only get to see people one time. Keep good notes if you have an intuition about something, and
be suspicious.
Be alert. Be alert. Don't let any stereotypes or any images, the outside of people. Don't let the outside or what their career is, the judge, the lawyer, the teacher, don't let that trick you. Be wiser than that.
Don't be superstitious, just be a little stitious.
Thank you for watching this video for family counseling on the role of the colluding woman and what we can do about it.